Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kevin Glatz. I'm a program facilitator with the Regina District Industry Education Council, working in the SunWest School Division. Today it's my pleasure to introduce to you Sam Turner, who's a sound or live sound audio technician, I guess is what is the formal title that he has on his presentation today. He works in Saskatoon. Sam grew up in Rosetown and took his schooling in Rosetown Central High School before taking some training in this field in Saskatoon. And then now he works in the entertainment industry, I think mostly in Saskatoon, but I guess we'll hear about that more in the presentation. So just a reminder before we begin, this session is being recorded and it will appear on the RDIEC YouTube channel at rdiec.ca. And also on that website, you'll find a survey for students. And if you do that survey, complete that survey, you get your name in a monthly draw for a $50 gift card. So we encourage you to go to our website at www.rdiec.ca, complete the survey, and take a look at what we have to offer on our YouTube channel. That's it for myself. Sam, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thanks for the introductions, Kevin, and thanks for having me. My name's Sam Turner, and as you've heard, I work as an audio technician in the live events industry. I work for a company called Barn Dog Productions. We're based out of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. We do work all over the province. We do some work in Manitoba, but primarily in Saskatoon. I've been there a little over 10 years now, and hopefully this presentation can give you a brief overview of what my job looks like and some of the things that I do and some of the things that I work with. Okay. So the primary purpose of an audio technician in live events is sound reinforcement. At its simplest definition, this is just taking your source signal, whatever that may be, and making it loud enough that your intended audience can hear it clearly. In our case, this involves designing, installing, and implementing audio systems with enough power and coverage to fill the intended venue with a clear, undistorted sound. So we provide the equipment necessarily to also capture and process the various input signals and operate it during the shows. This is also going to include like setup, tear down, transportation of the gear, maintenance of the equipment, all sorts of things involved with that. A few of the more specific roles included with this are front of house engineers. They're going to be the ones who are responsible for doing the actual mix that the audience is hearing out of the main PA system, generally done through a soundboard. Monitor engineers are going to be the ones taking care of the audio that's being directed back towards the stage, allowing performers and presenters and whoever needs to hear themselves to hear themselves. Anything else that they need to do to do their jobs. It's done by sending multiple mixes to various speakers placed around the stage, sometimes to in-ear monitor units and belt packs that are worn by the performers. Many shows will have a separate system engineer whose sole purpose during the show is to constantly monitor the various components of the PA system, make sure amplifiers aren't overheating, things aren't distorting or being driven too hard, everything's functioning correctly, all that. Depending on the size and budget of the production, oftentimes multiple roles will be taken on by one sound technician. So obviously, if it's a smaller show, they might not have the budget to afford 4 or 5 people running around doing those sort of jobs. And if it's something smaller, like a speaking gig, something like that, you don't necessarily need someone overviewing the monitors separately. That can all be done off of one console. On even larger productions, though, this will occasionally be broken down into even more specialized roles, with multiple system techs, dedicated RF techs monitoring wireless frequencies, techs whose sole role is just patching the stage, making sure that all of the hundreds of wires that are being connected throughout for different changeovers, all that sort of thing, are all being kept track of. All sorts of roles involved there. And then there's multiple other facets of production as well that I'll get into a little bit later. Some of the skills and traits. So there's a variety of skills that are useful in this field, but I'd say far and above the most important is active and critical listening. Your ears are by far your most important tool. It's important to take care of them. It's the biggest skill that you'll develop over time and one that you're constantly expanding on, developing. There's always room for improvement there. There's all sorts of powerful audio analysis tools, spectrum analyzers, sound pressure level meters, all sorts of things that you can use. But at the end of the day, they don't mean a thing if you can't put it into context, and it requires a human ear to do that. You need to have a clear understanding of signal flow, where the audio is traveling as it's being captured from its source into a microphone, processed through mixers, eventually through other processing, and then eventually amplified out of the loudspeakers into your venue. You also need to have an idea of how those sound waves are going to be interacting in the venue that you're working in as well. This is very important for speaker placement and tuning PA systems to rooms. Obviously, different sizes of rooms, different shapes of rooms, different materials in rooms, even the temperature, all sorts of things will affect the way that audio will travel. It's important being comfortable learning the ins and outs of a variety of different equipment. It's a fast-paced and our fast-moving industry. There's always new technology, the bigger, better things coming out, and it's important to stay on top of it and just be comfortable with learning how to operate new equipment all the time. Some amount of knowledge of how electricity works goes a long ways. You don't necessarily need to be an electrician in most cases, but it's very helpful to be aware of how much power the equipment that you're running is drawing, especially things like amplifiers that tend to draw a lot of power. Making sure your breakers aren't being overloaded, making sure that all of your equipment is operating optimally. Knowledge of electrical resistance is also needed when pairing amplifiers with speakers. So it's, like I say, there's all sorts of things that are handy to know there. A lot of equipment these days can be interfaced over Ethernet connections or even transmit audio this way. So as the industry is moving forward, it's becoming more and more necessary to have at least a base level of computer networking ability, just so you can make sure that all your equipment is properly talking to each other and you've got control over it. In installed sound situations, this also becomes more important. Attention to detail is very vital. There's a lot of moving parts in a live production. Knowing what's going on, where things are, goes a long ways into making sure that a stage is operating smoothly and keeping it operating on time, as you're generally working around sound check schedules, show start times, all sorts of things going on there. Being able to work effectively with others is also very important. Coordinating with artists, organizers, other techs, labor crews, communication is vital. And at times it can be a fast-paced and high-pressure environment. Not always, but it will happen. So it's important to be able to maintain a level head and effective workflow when there's a lot going on around you. Problems will arise. It's important to try to stay in front of them and to know how to effectively chase them and deal with them when they do come up. So being able to think on your feet there, being able to take accountability for what you're doing and sort of make sure that everything's on track can be quite a challenge at times. Workplaces. So our work takes place in a variety of different venues. You've got indoor concert halls like TCU Place here in Saskatoon. There's arenas like SaskTel Center. You got small to mid-sized venues like bars and clubs, outdoor amphitheaters, portable stages, conference rooms. If there's a place where you can fit an audience and we can set up a PA system, we've probably done it. It's not always as glamorous, but there's a non-zero amount of time spent loading and unloading equipment. That means moving it in and out of transport trucks. You got to get it to and from the venue and the shop somehow. And when it's back at the shop, you've got to make sure that gear is being properly maintained. We do a lot of work outside. So when you've got complex electrical equipment that's out in the elements for half the year, stuff tends to break down. It's important to stay on top of it. So we're always testing, keeping it up to date. And then as shows are being spec'd out, we've also got to make sure that the correct gear is being prepped and sent out to the right places. There's a lot of moving parts at work there. Here's a few examples from some of the shows I've done in the past couple of years. This setup was for Aqua at SaskTel Center. So here you can see we've got our PA system hanging from rigging points up in the ceiling there. This is our line array system that's pointing out and sort of servicing the main area. We've got some auxiliary speakers for outfills on the side that are servicing the areas that those don't quite cover. You can see some of the amp racks, that sort of thing that I'll get into a little later down here. We've got all sorts of lighting trusses and other moving parts going on with this production. And this is the same setup from a couple of days after that. It was being used for a EDM concert as well. It was one of the rare scenarios where we didn't have to tear down the night after. We were able to leave it up for a couple of days. So you can get just kind of another view of what was going on. There's the PA system hanging there. You can see all the lights, the video screen in action. There's some of the amp racks down at the bottom there and the monitor console. All that fun stuff. Here's a bit of a closer view of this. This picture's unfortunately a little bit blurry. It was taken in the dark out at Thunder Bay, the show we did out there this summer. So this is an example of the monitor world where I was working as the monitor engineer for this show. So you can see the soundboard sitting there. You can't really see the stage from this picture, but it's sort of off to the right there. So that's situated where I've got a nice clear view of all the artists so I can communicate effectively with them during sound checks and during the show to make sure that they're all hearing what they need to hear. We've got the whole rack full of wireless products sitting here. Some of the amplifiers that are powering the monitor speakers down here. Some of the amplifiers that are powering the main system over here. Just a whole pile of equipment. This is an example from one of the festivals we do out in Manitoba at Dauphin's Country Fest. So here's the stage kind of midway through the day. One of the supporting acts is playing. You can see that it gets incredibly full of equipment. This is why it's important, very important to sort of know where everything's going, to keep it as organized as you possibly can. So if any problems do arise, you always know where you need to go to sort them out. You can see, yeah, all of their equipment is lined up in front of the headliner's gear. Tons of stuff on there. Here's a picture from later that night with the headliner playing. You can see the stage looks a little more clear. We've moved a lot of that other stuff off. Just the stuff that we need for the headlining act is up there now. And then just to sort of give some context to what the space looks like afterwards, this is the day after when everything's been loaded into the truck. All the gear is off, ready to go to the next show. So you can see it's quite a lot of stuff that moves in and out throughout the course of the days. Here's just a shot I thought was kind of neat from the Saskatoon exhibition with Our Lady Peace playing. It's kind of just a neat view of things from on stage. And here's an example of a setup we did for the Huskies for their dog's breakfast fundraiser. So this is at Prairieland Park. We've got a whole bunch of lights up in the roof, making the whole place nice and green with their Husky colors. So this was more of a speaking presentation. There was no artists performing. It was just sort of music, videos, people doing speeches at podiums. So we don't need quite as large of a sound system for this. It's a little hard to see, but in the back there, we've got speakers hanging by the stage that are servicing the front area of tables. Now, obviously, this is quite a long room. If those speakers were turned up loud enough so that the people way in the back here could hear clearly, it would be blowing the heads off of everyone up front. So that's why in this scenario, we've got another line of speakers farther back in the room that's servicing the areas out here so we can get a nice even sound distribution. In scenarios like this, we actually have to make sure that these speakers are time aligned to these ones. If everything was firing audio at the same time, it wouldn't take as long for the sound to leave this speaker and hit people sitting here as it would for the sound to leave these speakers and reach the same people. So if we didn't do anything, you would be hearing two sources of audio. It gets quite disorienting, hard to listen to. So we actually align it so that these speakers don't start playing their audio until enough time has passed, usually just a few milliseconds, for the audio waves to actually reach from this speaker, hit this point, and then they can service this area in conjunction, make sure it's one nice, clear audio signal. Here's an example of an outdoor setup that we do behind the Besborough for Rock the River. So in this case, we're providing the stage, lights, audio, everything. This was just if you've ever been back there, it's just kind of an empty little grass pit when nothing's going on. So we've got stage decks that we hauled in. We've got scaffolding towers that got set up to hang the roof from. You can't really see the PA with all of the scrim and stuff in front of it, but it's hanging there from rigging points up at the top of the scaffolding. And we've got subwoofers stacked there. Just another one of the setups that we do. Tools of the trade. So mixing consoles are by far one of the most important pieces of gear that we use. Most mixing consoles these days are digital. Sometimes small analog boards still show up when limited control is needed for smaller shows, but the larger ones that in this day and age are just far too impractical and require a lot more outboard gear to get the same amount of processing out of them. They're just, they generally don't get used for most live events anymore. The bulk of what we do would be on digital consoles. They provide far more tools to process and control the audio, and you get a far larger count of inputs and outputs in a smaller desk. So they're used to route all of the individual channels. All the sources of audio that are coming into the system would get mixed through here using tools like gains, equalizers, compressors, reverbs, delays, all sorts of different ways to process and affect it. And then those are going to get condensed down into coherent mixes, which are going to be sent out of the various outputs of the consoles. They can vary quite a lot in price depending on their different applications, their different processing powers, and the audio quality. The one in the middle is an example of a Midas M32. It's sort of one of the standard consoles you see around in small to mid-sized venues these days. They're around $3,000. They're just a nice, affordable point for a lot of venues to work with. The one that's on the right here, this is an Avid 6L. That's sort of one of the flagship consoles of the more professional end of the industry these days. This something like this would cost more around $150,000 depending on the specific model. So there's quite a range of professional audio products depending on the level of shows and productions that you're dealing with. Loudspeakers are another very important part of a PA system. They're generally classified into passive or active speakers. So passive speakers require external amplifiers. There's nothing in the box except for the speaker cones or the horns. All of the power, all the processing is done externally. Active speakers will have their own built-in amplifiers, generally their own built-in processing as well. There's sort of different advantages to both kinds depending on the specific setups. Powered speakers, they're nice if you've got something smaller that's kind of less gear that you have to haul out, but then you also have to run more cabling because you've got to run signal to your speakers. You've also got to run separate power. They're nice for indoor setups, that kind of thing. Passive speakers, when you've got your amplifiers separately, you only have to run one cable to send your signal and your power down the same line. They're handier for outdoor setups where you don't necessarily want the more complex parts of your system exposed to the elements. And when you're hanging stuff up in the roof for a lot of stuff like that, it makes more sense to go with passive speakers, just because then if you have any issues with your amplifiers or anything during the show, you can address them on the ground without having to stop the show, pull the whole PA system down. The speakers on the right, this is an example of a line array system. They're what tends to be used in the industry these days for larger venues. So it's essentially just a whole array of speakers stacked on top of each other, just like that looks. They're going to have quite a wide horizontal spread and a narrow vertical spread. That's going to give us better control over individual sections of the venue. So like these speakers that are pointing towards the bottom, they're not going to be shooting quite as far as the ones at the top. So we can process them differently, turn them down a little quieter, try to get a nice even spread so that across the whole audience, you get the most consistent sound. Amplifiers and processing units. So like I mentioned, when you're using passive speakers, amplifiers are necessary. They provide different amounts of power depending on the systems, depending what you need. Most of them these days are digital and have their own amount of processing as well on them. So they've got their own EQs, they'll have limiters, different ways of affecting and protecting the system. Crossovers and other devices are also occasionally used for making sure that everything's in line with your system. So with the different kinds of speakers, you're going to have horns that are taking care of your high frequencies. You'll have mid drivers taking care of everything in the middle. You'll generally have subwoofers that are taking care of the low end frequencies. Different sizes, shapes of speakers work better for different frequencies. They require different amounts of power distribution for that as well. So like subwoofers generally tend to be quite big. Those low frequencies require a lot more energy to actually move the air and produce them. When you've got your system broken up like that, you want to make sure that all of the different components are only receiving the frequencies necessary, so it runs more efficiently. It tends to sound a heck of a lot better. Crossovers are what we use for that. And then when we're talking about things like limiting, that's just making sure that there's caps on how loud the system is able to go. So if you've got other engineers coming in, that sort of thing, you don't have to worry about them coming in, cranking it, and then wrecking your equipment. Power distribution is also quite important with most sound systems, except for, well, any sound system really, the very smallest ones. Sometimes that's as simple as just plugging speakers into the wall outlets. Generally the big ones, we've got something like this distro on the right here, where we're going to have 50, 100, 200 amps of power running through these cam locks at the bottom, and then all of your various power distribution up at the top, so we can break it out into 15, 20, 30 amp breakers wherever we need it on stage. Keep it in concise locations so that we're not chasing power cords all over the place. It's also important making sure that you've got good grounding on your system. That's one of the big things that can cause unwanted noise in your audio systems. Knowing that you've got everything running through a nice clean power distro helps a lot with that. Microphones and DI boxes are also very important tools that we work with. There's many different kinds of microphones, all with different applications, from vocal mics with pop filters and diaphragms that are shaped and suited to picking up the ranges in a human voice, to large diaphragm microphones that are intended to capture the low frequencies and high sound pressure levels of things like kick drums, to to condenser microphones that are a lot more fragile and suited to the minute details of high frequencies. We use DI boxes for things like keyboards, bass amps. If you're plugging in a laptop, something like that, something that you've got a direct audio source from that's going straight into your system. And then wireless mics are also frequently used just for greater mobility on stage. And they come with their own set of things to deal with frequency coordination, making sure you've got clean channels there. As I mentioned before, sometimes on very large setups where you've got 60 to 100 different channels of various wireless things going on stage, you'll have someone whose sole job is just watching over the coordination of that. Okay, rewards of the occupation. So live event production can be an engaging and varied work environment. You're often working in different places under different circumstances with different people. Each show is going to provide its own set of challenges and short-term goals and opportunities to hone your craft. Just there's always things to do at the next show, something to look forward to there. There's always people to connect with, new facets of the industry to engage with. And there's plenty of opportunity to hone your technical skills because there's always new equipment to learn, new gear to play with. But there's also a great opportunity to stretch creative muscles as well, particularly when it comes to actually mixing a show. There's plenty of things that are kind of just good practice, reasons why some things work and some things don't, but there's a lot of nuance involved in putting together a mix. No two engineers are ever going to listen to something the exact same way, and no two engineers are ever going to mix something the exact same way. And you get to make it happen. For many of us in the industry, myself included, there's a profound inspiration and connection that comes from live music and events. There's a lot of work that goes on into making them happen, and it can be a very rewarding thing to be a part of. There are obviously also challenges in the occupation as well. The hours can be quite unsocial. Many shows take place in the evening, meaning you're typically working quite late at night. Production crews are usually the first to arrive on site and the last to leave. So you're there setting up before any of the acts, before anyone's there, trying to get ahead of sound checks. You're there for the show, you're tearing down after. It's long hours, lots of work, but it's also enjoyable. As I mentioned earlier, it can be high stress at times. If and when problems arise, you often have a limited amount of time to address them. Promoters and organizers and other clients often have a lot of money invested in these events. They're looking for them to go as smoothly as possible, whether it's an audience of 100 people or 10,000 people. And I suppose it likely happens in most occupations, but you will inevitably on occasion encounter egos and people who are difficult to work with. I don't know that there's any getting around that in life. And in these situations, it's just important to maintain a thick skin and be professional. That's, I think, the best way forwards in those unfortunate scenarios. And if you're primarily doing freelance work, working directly with artists and bands and or running your own company, that kind of thing, you will need to be putting in a lot of time and effort into networking. Who you know goes a long ways in this industry. I wasn't entirely sure where to place the typical yearly income range for this occupation because it can be quite varied depending on the types of shows you're working, the places you're working for, how frequently you're working, and how much experience you have to offer. I did a little digging on it, and the average yearly income I found for a live sound engineer in Canada was cited around $65,000. I'd say that sounds about right these days. You'd likely be starting out less than that depending on where you are, but there's also a lot of opportunity to reach higher than that as well, depending on, like I say, the kind of shows that you're working. Benefit and pension options are going to also vary a lot depending on where you're working. There's not really any one answer to that. If you're primarily working full-time with a production company or a venue, depending on the size of the company, oftentimes they'll have their own individual policies. If you're mainly doing freelance and contract work, you'll likely have to work something out on your own there. And there's usually a good opportunity to take holiday time during your slow seasons. Depending on the aspects of the industry you're working in, you'll usually have parts of the year that are a lot busier than others. where I work, we tend to be swamped during the summertime, during the outdoor festival season. I couldn't imagine taking more than a day or two off there, but the winter time slows right down for us. It's perfect for getting a couple of weeks off to go travel, things like that. Some of the indoor venues like TCU Place here in town, I know they work sort of the opposite, where they've got tons of productions and meetings and that sort of thing going on through the winter time. But then in the summer, when everyone's putting on their events outside, they slow right down. So it's all going to depend on which aspects of the industry you're working in there. There's no strict high school courses that I would say are real requirements to get into the field, but I would say that math and computer sciences are both quite important skills to have. So I definitely recommend looking into those. Some amount of musical knowledge never hurts. It helps put things in context, help develop your ear. I know with particularly in the aspects of the industry I work in, woodworking and shop work actually might not be a bad skill to have. All of our gear has to be transported safely in road cases so that it's not getting damaged while it's traveling in the trucks, that kind of thing. So knowing your way around a set of tools never hurts when it comes to putting those together. And while larger universities sometimes offer audio courses, usually tied into their music or drama programs, the bulk of audio related post secondary learning is found in specialized tech schools, trade schools. They're usually more geared towards recording and mixing in studios, with smaller segments of the courses being dedicated to live sound. Although a lot of that information is going to be important in both fields, there's a lot of crossover there. If you're interested in audio engineering at all, I would highly recommend talking to Sean or Doug from the Recording Arts Institute of Saskatoon. They're both wonderful people, and the program there was fantastic. I went through it and enjoyed it quite a lot. Metalworks out in I think it's Mississauga, so out in Ontario, is another school that gets cited for being quite well. The Vancouver Film School is supposed to have quite a renowned audio program there. It's another one to look into, but there's several different schools around. Those are just some ideas for places to start looking. There's a lot of new concepts and piles of information to learn when you're approaching the live event production industry. We deal with a lot of things that most people don't really consider in their day-to-day lives. So courses are a fantastic way to familiarize yourself with a lot of it. However, expect to do a lot of learning through experience on the job. It's one of those things where you're going to get out of it what you put into it. Good people skills and work ethic also go a very long ways towards finding and securing work in this industry. Like I mentioned before, it's a lot about who you know as much as what you know. And opportunities. So COVID-19 hit our industry particularly hard. We adapted where we could, but with almost zero live events taking place for well over a year, a lot of places had to close up shop, and a lot of freelance workers were forced to find other forms of employment to get them through it. They didn't all come back to the industry. As such, there's been large gaps for the last couple of years, and many places that are still in need of more capable hands and running kind of short staffed at the moment. I don't know how that will look a couple of years from now, but I'd be shocked if a lot of production companies aren't still looking for new talent in the industry by then. And there's not really a set in stone career track through this industry. Most people have their own unique paths they take through it. Generally, larger shows and bigger venues with higher profile acts require more experienced technicians and offer higher wages. That's one of the big things that a lot of people shoot for. Production companies and staffing at venues may offer opportunities internally for advancement and promotion. A lot of technicians choose to pursue work with touring acts, going out on the road. A lot of people do a mix of both depending on the season. They might go on the road with a few bands during the summertime and then come work at a production house during the wintertime, something like that. And a lot of people look into purchasing their own gear and owning their own company. There's plenty of guys around that own their own small systems and do a variety of gigs around. Like I say, a lot of that's going to depend on how adept you are at networking and how much time you want to spend putting yourself out there into that, and how much you're able to invest into that as well. There's a wide variety of related occupations that also involve work with audio, and many others involved with live events as well. We've got recording engineers who work in studios who are going to capture, edit, mix, and master tracks. We've got operators required on film sets to capture location audio, and post-production engineers who are going to use that audio and additional Foley, dialogue recording, other various sound effects to construct mixes you hear when you're watching any sort of television programming. If you're watching something and you hear a sound, someone has deliberately put it there. Hotels, conference rooms, Some schools require audiovisual teams, generally making sure speakers, presenters are heard, projection screens are operational. There's sort of whole companies that deal with that, with the hotels around town, that kind of thing. In live events, we often work with dedicated lighting technicians, video technicians, backline technicians, who are, so that's taking care of like drum kits, guitar amps, all of the instruments that are required, all those sort of things. There's various other technicians and other aspects of the industry. They don't all have an easy way to kind of to look into training for it necessarily. A lot of that's stuff that people sort of find their way into on their own, but there are plenty of specializations to look into when you're in the industry. Event organizers handle logistics of coordinating with venues, equipment suppliers, bands and performers, promoters. We've got tour managers acting as go-betweens between artists, and venues, and suppliers, along with organizing all the travel details. There's whole teams of people that are involved with those sort of things, the planning and logistics of events. Some companies specialize in more permanent installations, as I've mentioned, anywhere like airports, malls, schools, rinks, anywhere that needs a public address system. You've got someone that's installed it, someone that's designed it, someone that's put it together. Some places specialize more in that. Some places sort of do it as part of their work. I know the company I work for, we do some amount of that, generally more in our off season, as we don't have much time to be going out for those sort of calls during festival season. And some people with more specific specialization in the field look into instruction. You'll see various seminars and courses coming up on specific things. Like I say, RF frequency coordination is one of them. There's various companies that manufacture gear. Sometimes we'll have people on their roster who are helping them promote and sell their gear, and they'll know the ins and outs of it, and they'll be putting on various courses on that. Work-life balance. It can admittedly be a tricky thing in the field. A lot of people who stay in the industry do it because they have a particular passion for it, whether that's in music, just interest in the technology, the social aspects. It's one of those jobs that you definitely have to enjoy what you do and have something motivating you through it, because occasionally it can be, like I say, tough work, long hours, that sort of thing, but also very enjoyable. You'll need to be flexible on your schedule. So obviously you're not necessarily working every single night. Sometimes you don't know necessarily which nights you are going to be working. It's you've got to be able to work around things there, know when and where to set boundaries. Hours tend to be very long. So it is something to take in consideration how well you're able to function on an inconsistent schedule. I know some people handle that better than others. It's one of the many things to account for. And then, like I say, it's helps to take advantage of slow seasons and busy seasons, sort of get your time in where you can. And my journey. So I started with an interest in music. I started playing guitar in a band when I was a teenager. I absolutely loved that. Wanted to see if there was a way I could pursue that further. So I applied to the Grant MacEwan University out in Edmonton, aiming for a bachelor in music. It turns out the guitar program is quite difficult to get into. There was many people with the same idea, and most of them had far more formal music training than I did. So I was unsuccessful there. I wanted to find another way to see if I could work in the music industry. So I applied to the Recording Arts Institute of Saskatoon. I took their audio engineering course, and I graduated as the first student to pass the program with honors. Had a lot of fun doing it. I got quite lucky. It was a couple days before the final exam. One of the directors mentioned that there was a place in town hiring and said, "Hey, take your resume down this afternoon." So I did. And I started working at Barn Dog Productions about a day before my final exam at the program. Been there for about the last 10 years or so, and I'm currently the senior audio engineer at the company, barring my boss. And I primarily cover monitor engineer and system tech duties at most of our bigger stages. So I'm making sure everything on stage is all working operational. And I also run front of house sound as well, though. I also work as a backline tech, depending on what the individual show requires. You're never doing the same thing 2 days in. And yeah, so I've worked various shows, various festivals around. We do a lot of the bigger events in Saskatoon, like the exhibition main stage. We rock the river. We've done Jazz Fest some of the years. We do festivals out in Manitoba during the summer. All sorts of fun stuff. And I think that sort of brings it to the end of the presentation that I had prepared there. I guess if we want to move to any questions that you guys have.
I had questions written down, Sam, and you just kind of kept answering them for me.
Well, that's good to hear.
I think you were pretty thorough. I guess one question I had is like just to get my head around this. Like, so this Barn Dog Productions, the company you work for. So are they kind of multifaceted? They do sound and stage and lighting and all that stuff together.
Yep. So we do sound, we do lighting, we do video, and we do staging, and we have rigging products as well. We do most things that are involved with event production. Sort of
So
more specifically geared to a lot of outdoor stuff. Like I say, we've got our own staging, we can provide our own roofing and that sort of thing. So if a festival or a show is trying to put something on and say like an empty field, something like that, we could bring everything in and cover it all.
yeah, yeah. So do you do you just stick to the audio end of it, or are you kind of, as part of the company, it's your main responsibility is the audio, but you're
Mhm.
at some point you're setting up staging too and stuff like that?
Yep. So I primarily specialize in audio. I do a lot of work with, like I say, the backline as well. So the instruments provided when just a lot of touring acts won't be traveling with their own guitar amps, drum kits, that sort of things. We've got to make sure that those are provided and all taken care of. So those are the two fields I mostly specialize in. But yeah, I am involved with the staging and the lighting occasionally as well.
So I guess that's the other question. I didn't realize that when you just said that. Like some touring artists don't actually have their own equipment with them. I always thought it was
Yep.
like they all had everything all the time.
Yeah, so they'll usually be carrying things like guitars, some of the more specific things they'll generally have with them, but a lot of the rest of the equipment's just too bulky to travel, especially if they're flying in, that sort of thing. So there's companies like ours that'll be providing that depending on the show.
So how common is it for, somebody's coming to Saskatoon for a concert, for them to actually hire a local production company to do all that, or do they? Again, I was under the impression they travel with their own crew, but or does
Yeah,
it depend on?
it'll really depend on the size of the show. So like smaller venues, like say like what's it called now? Like the what used to be the Odeon, those sort of places, they'll usually have their own systems that are permanently installed there. Somewhere like Sastel Center, they would have to set something up. Some of the more mid-scaled productions generally wouldn't be traveling with their own gear for that, just because it is a lot of truck space to haul around and a lot more money involved. It's usually cheaper to have that sourced locally. A lot of the bigger ones though will as well. So sometimes you'll see the ones coming in with 5-10 semis worth of stuff. They're usually hauling all their own stuff, but it varies.
Burnett, do you have any questions?
Just one question. That was so awesome. Wow. Like I said, I did write a few down too, and you kept answering it.
Mhm.
I'm just wondering about creative freedom when you build your stage. I noticed the one, and what sparked this question was, I think it was the dog's breakfast. You have the green lighting.
Oh, yeah.
Was that a recommendation or a request from the Huskies, or is that something that you would suggest to them? How does the look come to be for a lot of these productions?
That's a great question. It's generally going to depend a lot on a show to show basis. With something like that, we would generally be working directly with the client. So in that case, here, I can scroll back up to that. They wouldn't necessarily have said, hey, we want this done specifically like this. It would be more of a general, hey, we want the room to look a certain way. We want the whole thing to be lit up green. We want to have and like you can see, you've got the screens sort of surrounding this middle podium they've got in the center. That might have been an idea that the client had. You're usually you're talking back and forth with them, figuring out what they want the event to look like, some of the general ideas they have. That can be more or less specific depending on a case to case basis. But yeah, so you're usually working directly with the client or the promoter, or whoever's putting on the event, trying to get an idea of what they expect to see, what they would like the event to be like. And then you're working to find a way to put that together. It's kind of going to depend on like something like this. I would say you'd probably have a little more creative freedom there, just because we're trying to make the whole room look big and green and have it be this big exciting event that people are coming out to. There's tons of ways to do that. Something like a more typical stage setup, it's generally going to be a little more in line with like you've got to make sure you've got a front wash that's enabling you to see all the performers. You're going to have lighting behind them. There's different ways that you can set that up and all sorts of different things you can do there. But yeah, it's really just going to depend on an event to event basis there. But I'd say there's a fair bit of freedom and just trying to figure out the best way to make it happen.
That's awesome. Yeah, because I attend a lot of live events, and it's so funny when you walk in, the ambiance or the how it's created, or that really adds to that whole experience. So
Mhm.
this was awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, you're very
And
welcome.
I guess, and I mean, I think I knew this, and I think probably most people realize this, that it's really technical, and it's really, this goes way beyond like plugging a couple things in and turning on a switch.
Yeah, it's I wasn't sure sort of how in depth to get on some of that. I don't want to lose people that are just sort of looking to get a start on seeing what it's about, but there is quite a lot that goes into it. There's like I say, using your ears is quite important when it comes to processing all of the different signals. When you're dealing with a band production, you've generally got a mic or an input coming from every single thing that you've got on stage. It's like all the mics or all the drums are going to have their own microphones. Every amplifier, everything's got its own signal that we're processing differently, and trying to make sure that they're all coming together cohesively. All the frequencies are working together with each other. There's a fair bit that goes into making it all work.
Well, and I think I'm so glad there's a program now, like right in Saskatchewan, right in Saskatoon, because I mean, I think it's fairly obvious this is something you need some training for. It's not like you just can walk in.
Yeah, like there's a lot of resources available online for things to look into, but it's, yeah, I would definitely recommend looking into some amount of course learning on it, because there's a lot.
I appreciate the comment that you made about for students, because I think there are a lot of creative students out there looking into careers like this. And the fact that you mentioned that COVID kind of set this whole industry back, but
Yeah.
there are potentially jobs. And I think that's always the one thing students want to know about. And I think parents want to know about this too, because this isn't a career right now that makes a lot of money initially. I think you build into it.
Yeah, generally.
But I think it is definitely a viable option for students. So thank you.
Like I say, it's one that I will say, like especially going through some of those courses and programs, like one of the things they told us when I went to Reyes, they're just like, this is a jumping off point. Having this course isn't going to be any like guarantee that you're just going to jump straight into a job. A lot of that's going to be dependent on your own networking skills, and you do have to look for work. But yeah, like I say, we had quite a rough couple of years through COVID, lost a lot of good people that way. So there's definitely room for if people are interested. We could always use more techs right now.
That's awesome, Sam. Please, thank you so much. This is it's kind of a unique. I just think it's a unique occupation that we haven't really in our time here doing these, haven't really had much like this. So it's really good to hear, and I'm really glad I finally contacted you.
Yeah, me too. This has been a lot of fun. It's definitely an industry that I think a lot of people just aren't super aware of how much goes on in our industry and what's actually there until you've had an opportunity to kind of pull back the curtain a little bit and look at what goes on, because there's quite a lot.
Yeah. Well, yeah. See, and your session's gonna it really points that out. So I hope lots of students get to see this. So